thank you everyone for joining in. I'm Priya Krishnamurthy. I'm the founder of 200M and supported by an incredibly talented team of people, many of whom started out as volunteers and who have really owned the vision that we have. Essentially, we started out as a COVID response platform back in April 2020. And thereafter, we've sort of pivoted to what we call ourselves an ecosystem enabler. That hopes to bridge gaps in knowledge, resources, and partnerships for the artisan sector as a whole. Our primary focus right now is to build evidence for the sector, which means we do research, and we do a lot of research. Our first report was businessofhandmade.com, which should, if you go to businessofhandmade.com, you will see the work that we've done. And thereafter, currently we're working on a very exciting research project supported by C3 Grant Making, which is looking at the investment needs of craft-based enterprises in India. So really excited to take this journey forward and also to support, enterprises and other ecosystem enablers who are really as passionate about, supporting the artisan economy as us. And in this journey is when I, met Erinch when he was still part of WFTO, and we've had ongoing conversations and really excited that he's part of the Doughnut Economics Action Lab. And really excited to present this evening with him and to, help bring some of his insights working in the sector and how that can benefit all of us. Over to you, Erinch.
Thank you, Priya. It's an absolute delight to be here. I'm quite, I was saying earlier that it feels like a bit of a homecoming because in so many ways, my career has been in and around the artisan sector. In my previous role, in my thinking, and I'm quite passionate about the role that actually it plays in the future about our economies, our planet, our societies, and so yeah, absolute privilege, and thank you for making time for me. So a little bit more about me. I started life in the business world. I was at Procter & Gamble for a while trying to do brand strategy. So I started with sort of a global corporate perspective, then moving on to the aid and development world, working mostly with farmers and smallholder farmers across Indonesia for a number of years. Then moving to Oxfam, where I sort of led campaigns as well as enterprise programming to support communities that were being left behind and were low pay and all sorts of human rights issues going on, to most recently working for the World Fair Trade Organization as the Chief Executive Officer, based in the Netherlands, but operating in 80+ countries. And now I work, I guess, on planet Earth. I work on the global perspective about how we can live within the means of our living planet. And what does business need to do? What does business need to look like for us to achieve this so that we meet the needs of everybody, but without overshooting on the boundaries of our planet? So if that hasn't made a lot of sense to you, I'm going to give a little bit more of an introduction to Doughnut Economics before I move on to some insights on the artisan enterprise world, what we're calling enterprise design as a perspective of how do we shape, build, structure, and create enterprises and business models and business structures, before reflecting again on what does all of this mean for the artisan enterprises that are so important in our world. Doughnut Economics, well, it's built on the observation from how the 21st century has begun. It's begun with a financial meltdown that I think people around the world felt in 2008 and beyond. It's led to a climate breakdown that we've seen around the world. And this is only increasing, only accelerating the impacts of climate change. And it's also created COVID lockdowns for us because we've encroached on the space of nature. And now it's also having effects on health and disease around the world. So we are in a time of crisis. We're in times of increased crisis. And as a response to these crises, Doughnut Economics evolved as a compass for human prosperity. It was created by my friend and colleague, Kate Rayworth, who built on the planetary boundaries work of others, particularly the Stockholm Resilience Center, and brought together the social and ecological perspective into one. So started with the observation that, yes, we live on a planet that that has very specific boundaries, and we cannot overshoot those boundaries. We need to preserve the life-supporting systems of this living planet that we all rely on. But at the same time, we also can't fall short of life's essentials for the billions of people around the world. We cannot shrink our economies to a point where we don't have enough food and water and livelihoods and all the social benefits that business and our economy creates. And it's in that space between the outer concentric circle, the planetary boundary, and the inner concentric circle, the social foundation, that lies a donut-shaped space. And that's the safe and just space for humanity. That space needs to be built. That space needs to be constructed through our new economies that we evolve. So that's the vision. And this vision has taken off quite a bit. It's been sort of quoted around the world, from presidents to the Pope using it in his economy of Francesco, to being sort of, you know, embraced in every continent by different political, economic, and community leaders. And it's pointed us towards a very particular kind of crisis. And that crisis is that we are not doing well. We are not living within the boundaries of our planet, and we are not delivering for people around the world. So we are both in overshoot of our planetary boundaries, and we are in shortfall. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, research came out for the first time to allow us to quantify chemical pollution. And that research has showed us that we are also in red. So an updated version of this donut diagram, which will likely come later this year, will also include an additional red overshoot on chemical pollution as well as most of the other planetary boundaries that we know we need to live within. And the shortfall, I think, is of no surprise to anyone. We know that there are hundreds of millions of people that go hungry, that are not earning enough income to meet their basic needs around the world. So our economy is overusing and under-delivering at the same time. With that in mind, we can also look at this through a country lens. So what do countries look like? Well, a very clear picture emerges that the richest countries in the world have been able to meet most of the social needs of their populations, but they've done this by hugely overusing planetary resources. So that the pathway to development that has come from the rich countries of the world, those with higher average incomes, is not a sustainable model. We cannot follow their lead. As you can see, the US, UK, China, all in huge overshoot, are overusing natural resources and are in overuse of planetary boundaries in delivering to different extents the social benefit that they need to provide. While more underdeveloped countries like Malawi, for instance, are actually not using even their allocated share of planetary resources. They are not in overshoot, but they are in huge shortfall on the social requirements. So huge levels of poverty and undernutrition, for instance, in a lot of countries in the global south. I had a look at India just before this call to add that to the mix, and also just threw in the Netherlands, another example of a country that I've lived in before, but also one that is often held up as a model of development. And again, the Dutch example shows us that it is not a developed country in that regard, because it actually needs to reconstruct its economy. It is in huge overshoot on planetary boundaries. India is in overshoots in a few areas, so phosphorus and nitrogen, especially in relation particularly to agricultural land use, but is also in huge shortfall on levels of social needs for its population. So I don't think this is a surprising picture for many. It just helps, I think, portray where we are overall. So what does this all mean for an artisan enterprise? And I want to reflect a little bit about, in a world where we need to meet the need, we need to reverse this picture. We need to meet the needs of as many people as possible and use as little resources as possible in meeting those together. I think a very unique sustainability story jumps out for artisan enterprises. And that sustainability story maybe helps us clarify the story by contrasting artisan production with, say, fast fashion or machine production. And it helps us understand, well, where does the value go? I mean, my experience in the artisan sector is actually the vast majority of the value goes to people who are in shortfall of life's essentials, those people that are in the inner circle of the social foundation, beneath the social foundation. So it actually deliberately increases the amount of value and livelihoods that are going to those people. Now, in supporting majority economically marginalized producers, it also has a very unique story to tell about, well, how does each unit of ecological footprint allow livelihoods to be sustained? So what's the return, the livelihoods return per unit of ecological footprint? It might sound like quite an academic exercise to compare that, but actually what it tells us is that, right, we do have some of Earth's resources to use. We, as we see, even India is only an overshoot of a couple of planetary boundaries, but actually it's below its budget for most. So it's okay for there to be a planetary footprint, an ecological footprint by industry, by business, but we need to maximize the social benefit that comes out of that. And that's what the livelihoods benefit can really, I think, help underline for us. In other words, I believe there's a story to tell around the sustainability of artisan enterprises where you get more social benefits with each sale compared to the alternatives. There's also a story around product longevity, that the fast fashion sector, for instance, if we contrast artisan production with fast fashion, and I know that artisan enterprises aren't just in fashion, they're in homewares, they're in other gifts, etc., other sorts of product lines as well. And I think the same story holds there. But an artisan produced garment, homeware product, etc., is more likely to be held for longer, used, loved, and connected with the consumer than something you pick up at a chain store that's been made en masse in fast fashion factories around the world. You're more likely to hold on to it longer. And if you think about the donut, if you think about how we need to decrease our ecological footprint while increasing our social benefits, then this story starts becoming quite compelling. Now, what I've put here isn't a formulated final story. It's an indication, it's a question mark about, is this a direction for the artisan enterprise sector to more effectively communicate about how its social benefits per unit of ecological footprint is so much more beneficial than alternatives that actually we need to deliberately foster, we need to deliberately promote, we need to deliberately support artisan enterprises as a way of living within the means of our planet and making sure everyone's needs are met. So open question, but I suspect there's a unique story around this. So with that in mind, I wanted to sort of give a little bit of an introduction into why at Doughnut Economics Action Lab, what we're saying is that what's really critical is the design of enterprises. And what we mean by that, I'm going to unpack in a second, and I'm going to do that through, a focus specifically on the artisan enterprise sector. But the reason that the transformation of the businesses themselves is so pivotal is the observation that we currently have an economy that relies on take, make, use, lose culture. We take from Earth and we use, we make, we use, and we lose, and we repeat, and we repeat, and we repeat. And this model of production has benefited a few people. It has left current and future generations in a very difficult state in relation to our planet, but also our social stability. And clearly is not something that we can continue forever. This is a model of production, of trade, of product consumption that has to change, and has to change rapidly if we are to make sure that our planet remains safe for us to occupy as human species. And there are alternatives to this make, use, lose culture. And that is the regenerative models, including circular economy, including looking at the way we take biological nutrients and technical nutrients and we regenerate or restore them in order to minimize the loss of matter and heat, in essence, to minimize the loss of waste through the way that we make and we consume products. Again, the artisan enterprise sector has a really interesting story here. The fact that natural fibers are much more prominent in the artisan enterprises I've gotten to know during my time in the World Fair Trade Organization, for example, tells us that it has a unique story because it allows for circular economy to continue. If it is natural fibers, then the biological nutrients are kept intact and they are kept segregated, and it can be repurposed, reused, etc., broken down even for other use rather than just turned into waste. The technical nutrients are, the metals, for instance, and other things that are going to be, or the components of electronic products, which also can be restored, repaired, reused, refurbished, recycled. But if you think about the slide I presented just earlier, to reverse that picture, we have to get into some sort of circular model. It's not a luxury, it's something that we're going to be forced to do if we are going to survive on this planet, as I said. So that's the regenerative model. And there are many examples that come from around the world. An interesting example, Sanergy in Kenya, in the slums of Nairobi, which takes human waste by providing affordable toilets to people in those slums, turns that into fertilizer and other nutrients for farming, increasing the yields of farmers and allowing for additional income generation for the social enterprise in a way that's keeping those biological nutrients continuing. Fairphone, which some of you may have heard of, again, has designed a modular phone, which allows those technical components to be reused and repaired and replaced rather than throwing out the entire phone. A model that some of you may have heard of actually comes from the Body Shop and its plastic recycling partners, including Plastics for Change, which has got significant operations in India, working with cooperatives of waste pickers and applying principles of fair trade in the way that they are treated, and through that creating recycled products that are allowing for a much more regenerative model of containers for their products. Another example from the fashion industry, and this is a Swedish brand, but they've allowed for, they've designed their products in a way that the biological nutrients and natural fibers can be separated easily so that they can then be used for various things, including for growing food that is sold in their stores to people who are shopping there. So, a lot of these are emerging examples. They're not in the mainstream of the economy, but they help illustrate what regenerative enterprise can look like. And obviously, there's the other side of the coin. There's a divisive manner in which business is currently operating, which is meaning that opportunity and value is captured in the hands of the few. We've seen report upon report for nearly a decade now from organizations that are showing how globally inequality is increasing. Number of billionaires are increasing, and then that percentage of share going to the richest people is on the up. And we also need to reverse this. So a few examples actually from the artisan side of things about how to be distributive by design, how to share opportunity and value with all the people who create that opportunity and value. And I think those examples are actually quite clear that when we look at the artisan enterprises around the world. An example, Manos del Uruguay in Uruguay, which it works with 12 cooperatives of women producers and artisans. Some are weaving, some are doing the dyeing of the fabrics. It is owned entirely by those 12 cooperatives. It is governed by those 12 cooperatives, and all of its value, profits are going back into creating opportunities or sharing with those producers, the people who have made the products. An example just to the north of India in Nepal is my good friend Sunil, who manages Mahaguti, which is an amazing and inspiring social enterprise in Nepal that, again, reinvests all of its profits back into its model and is able then to remain committed to some communities that are incredibly difficult to do business with for other businesses. But because of the commitment of Mahaguti to its artisan producer groups, it continues that relationship, and it's a lifeline economically for producer groups, including those that are beyond some of the elements of the Maoist conflict happening in Nepal, that it's very difficult to do business and it creates opportunities for those individual artisans. An example, another one in Mumbai is this organization, Creative Handicrafts, that some of you may have may have heard of, run by an amazing man and again friend of mine, Johnny Joseph, who runs essentially a women worker-owned fashion factory. And again, all of the profits, all the focus, all the mission is focused on creating opportunities for women who otherwise would not have opportunities in the labor market. So they are deliberately investing into training people, even though they could go out and just hire individuals in a way that would make life easier for the organization, but they're deliberately working with underprivileged groups, giving them training, and then they become eventually owners, co-owners of the enterprise and co-governors of this organization. Another example of the artisan enterprise supply chain, if you will, is El Puente, based in Germany, where you've got a model of stakeholder governance where the suppliers, the organizations that El Puente is buying from, is also part of the ownership model and the governance model of El Puente. It's a part of the mix of stakeholders. So its own workers own a part of it, its community, the fair trade shops across Germany, hundreds of them that are themselves community-owned organizations are part of the ownership mix. So is the supply chain through a representative group that is elected by its supply chain, part of the ownership and governance group. Again, allowing it to remain focused on supporting artisan enterprises and smallholder farmers around the world. Houdini, an interesting example of actually giving away its intellectual property. It's deliberately making it open source. So it wants people to copy the way that it is producing because it will have greater impact. A different way of being distributive by design and opening up your sort of intellectual property to what others might see as competitors, but what Houdini would see as being collaborators. And then the organization Lush, which is a chain of cosmetics products in Europe, but again, deliberately paying greater taxes in countries and industries where that is not very common. People normally try to minimize their tax, but these are the kinds of distributive practices that are absolutely critical. So all of that to paint a picture of the kind of business world that I think we would like to see evolve if we're going to have this sort of transformation of our economy. But what does this have to do with enterprise design? Now, there's been a few clues about enterprise design in the examples I've given, but I'm just going to flesh it out a little bit more. So what we are arguing is that actually it is about the way we design our organizations, because that is absolutely pivotal in the kind of practices that are enabled, in the kind of impacts that we end up seeing, and the kind of long-term commitment that we know is absolutely critical to all of this. And that needs to be deliberately distributive and deliberately regenerative in the design of the organization or enterprise. So going from the 20th century design feature of how much financial value can we extract from this enterprise to the 21st century model of how many benefits can we generate in the way we design this enterprise. What does this mean for artisan enterprises? So I enjoyed grappling with this over the last couple of days because I know that, a lot of the artisan enterprises are smaller. A lot of them aren't necessarily attracting a huge amount of equity investment in growth. Some do, and that's fantastic when we've seen it. But a lot of them have grown organically through their own funds and are committed to their communities. But there are some artisan enterprise design traits that are still incredibly important. Now, before we go into those, we need to think about what's practical to take on. And none of the models that you're going to hear about are taken on as a blueprint. They're all, we need to decide which part of it is useful for an artisan enterprise. The timing is pretty pivotal. So if very early stage artisan enterprise, it might be really critical if you're looking to attract investment to have some of those conversations up front. So before, for instance, an investor comes in, regardless of the kind of investor that's coming in, being very deliberate, saying, look, I want to create space on my board for the artisan representatives. I want to create space for community representatives, or I want to reinvest a certain proportion of my profits every year back into specific programs to support artisans, or specific, programs to create new technological innovations or other ways of increasing impact. So having those conversations at the right time is absolutely pivotal, and it doesn't mean all of it has to happen up front, but some of it might be key, especially pre-investment coming in. Obviously, we need to be commercially successful. We need a bankrupt artisan enterprise is no good for anybody. We need to make sure that it has the flexibility, it has the nimbleness to make the decisions it needs to make. So figuring out how that design trait is going to help the commercial goals, but also to reach the right scale. And a part of this is figuring out what is the right scale, what is the right size. It might not be the current size you are, it might be bigger, but it's not bigger infinitely. So there is a level at which I think we need to put a target, at least at the beginning. So there is a bit of a goal about where is this thing going, and how do we then make decisions about the way we're designing our ownership, the way we're designing our governance and our relationship with finance to get there over time, as it evolves, as it grows. Maybe more formal requirements come in. So a very small enterprise might not have a complicated governance model, but maybe you get to, a few 100,000 turnover and something else kicks in. Getting a little bit bigger, something else kicks in. So there might be a way of thinking about the scale and the timing of those changes over time. And then what is the impact that needs to be locked in? That is absolutely key, because often that is going to be the thing that determines, the North Star of where the enterprise is going. I suspect for most artisan enterprises, it is about the well-being of the artisans and their communities. And so how do you design this organization so it remains committed to those communities, committed to those artisans, and is making trade-offs in favor of them while remaining commercially successful and nimble? And that's not an easy thing to navigate, but if I were to put myself in the shoes of artisan enterprises, that would be the question I would be asking myself. So I'm going to rush through a little bit the rest, because some of this is very general stuff I've presented about enterprise design, but I have tailored most of these to the artisan enterprise sector. So we use a framework that comes from the amazing thinker Marjorie Kelly that we've adapted and been inspired from her work. And what we do is we ask 5 overarching questions about design traits. So what is the purpose of the business? Why does it exist? What are its networks? Who is it in relationship with, both up and down the supply chain? And how does that lock in its mission and its purpose? Thirdly, we ask about governance. And then we ask about who owns it and its relationship with owners. And lastly, we ask about what's the relationship with finance overall, not just its owners, but other financiers who might come in. And through this, you get a picture of actually how is this enterprise designed. It's not a blueprint, it's a series of questions to prompt us to think about the right kind of design choices. Purpose, obviously, there's a big difference between a fast fashion factory that is trying to maximize its returns, that might actually shut down in country A and reset up in country B if costs are lower in the next country compared to the first, to an artisan enterprise. An example being one that I know quite well, Sasha Handicrafts in India. My good friend and president of the World Fair Trade Organization, Ripa Mehta, runs Sasha alongside her wonderful colleagues. And it is very clear about its purpose. Its purpose is about supporting those communities and advancing those principles of equity, transparency, social justice, and environmental concern. As such, it reinvests all of its profits back into that mission. And its governance model has got representatives from those producer communities in its board. It's being very deliberate about going, right, this is our purpose. We can write a purpose. It's not difficult to write a nice, well-worded sentence, but what's important then is how do we put this into the design of the organization? And I think that presents a very interesting way of adopting the purpose. Purpose can also be through various certifications, or it could also be reinforced through specific legal forms where one exists, cooperative or social enterprise legal forms, for instance. None of these are perfect. None of them lock it in every respect, but they are helpful in articulating and navigating that purpose longer term. Then we have networks. So those relationships particularly with suppliers, where actually the current model of the world economy is let's treat them as commodity markets. Let's move away from those that cost more, and we just sort of jump around to see which one has got the lowest price for the set quality that we can obtain. And obviously there have been loads of alternatives that create long-term partnerships with those suppliers, with those producer groups, etc., that come from the fair trade world, but elsewhere as well, to lock in the purpose through the networks. Now, it's also about leaving specific networks and joining progressive networks, like 200 Million Artisans, for instance, as a network, or as a loose community, I guess, of organizations that share a particular vision around the goals of artisan enterprises. The governance, absolutely pivotal, as you know, because now we're getting into decision making. We're getting into how trade-offs are navigated. We're getting into the culture and norms of the business, but also the structures of decisions, and moving away from the old model of doing this purely in service of financial benefits for shareholders and owners, to doing it in service of social and ecological benefits. These sound like, you know, very grand things to say, but there are good examples from, for instance, when we look at many venture capital finance organizations and enterprises, they get engineered through their governance to benefit the investors, to make sure that the investor has got the biggest exit possible, so the biggest way of increasing its value, but also doing it fast, doing it in a way that might put at detriment the mission of the organization. And the alternatives, like an example, again, one I know fairly well from Bangladesh, called the Jute Works, which that's what I've put there on the screen is from the website of Called the Jute Works. It's board, and as you can see, the majority of those board members are representatives of the producer groups. So it's made a deliberate decision to say, look, the governance of my organization is going to lock in this purpose. Ownership, obviously, I don't need to convince you guys how important who owns this is, and whether it's worker, producer ownership. Steward ownership is a concept that's come out of late, and particularly in Northern Europe, but spreading in the US as well, a way of just having shares held by a foundation, for instance, who can exercise a veto when the organization goes adrift from its purpose or its mission. Often more applicable for larger organizations and larger enterprises. And then when we get to finance, it's again thinking about how do we have a relationship with those who are financing the organization so that it is expanding the benefits. So the right-hand side, the finance serves the purpose, is baked into the organization. It gives it a long-term and a holistic perspective rather than a short-term and extractive financial perspective. So I've raced through a lot of those because I do want to get to my final couple of slides, which are asking us about, so what for artisan enterprise? What does all of this mean for artisan enterprises? Well, again, as a reminder, this framework helps us think through which design traits of the purpose, the networks, the governance, the ownership, the finance, draw the business into extractive mode versus which ones enable the business to become generative, to become much more led by its social or ecological purpose. It's usually a mix. Many businesses have a mix of these things. Now, the reason that this is so important, that enterprise design is so important, is that when we take again that big picture view of the donut, that we need to reverse that picture, we need to change that selfie that we see of ourselves on this planet, then we need a huge amount of solutions. We need a huge amount of actions, and those actions will come from, some will come from the state or the commons and civil society, etc., but some will need to come from business. But the actions that currently businesses can take that lead to maximum profits mean that only the bits that overlap with the maximum profit incentive are the ones that's enabled. And when we redesign enterprises, or we think about enterprise design in new, fresh, innovative ways, then we expand the art of the possible. So what does this all mean for artisan enterprises? Well, a couple of questions I would leave you with if you were thinking about the design of your enterprise. And that is, one, which impacts, stakeholders and actions are your priority? I'm going to assume it's the artisans themselves and their communities. It might be something else. It might be the local ecology as well. It might be other stakeholders that aren't coming to my mind, but being very clear about what is the priority here. It doesn't have to be one single one, but it has to be clear, because based on that, you can then ask yourself which voices you need to hear in the business, which voices you need in your boardroom, which voices you need echoing through your management system, which voices you need in your ownership mix to make sure that those stakeholders, those impacts and those actions that you want to prioritize are represented, are going to be your guiding North Star. Thirdly, thinking about the trade-offs, being very clear that, look, there might be trade-offs. Those trade-offs can be real. You know, what price you pay, how long you commit, what kind of risk you take in your contractual relationships with producers and communities, and the extent to which you invest into A versus B. You invest into growing your business or improving the skills of your artisans. There are trade-offs. I mean, with money can go to A or B often, and we need to make decisions. So being clear about how those trade-offs might arise and how you want to navigate them in your business. Well, also, as I mentioned earlier, what scale do you actually want to reach? I remember a conversation about 4 years ago with an amazing organization called Last Forest in India, with Matthew John, who's another good friend that I've met through the fair trade movement there, who once said to me, after I talked about scale and I talked about impact investing, he said, look, Erinch, you might want to make 100 of us rather than making us 100 times bigger. You know, and that doesn't mean none of us need to grow. That we probably do. Many need to grow sales, but what is the scale at which it's the right healthy balance, I think, is going to really help determine the future of the artisan enterprise. And then which of those design traits will help us achieve those goals commercially, but also in terms of impact, and being very open about, right, but these are, you know, we need some representatives from this stakeholder group or that stakeholder group, but how do we balance it? How do we create the right kind of commercial and impact mix that's going to allow this to be a success? So my last substantive slide is this one, because I have worked in and around the artisan sector for a few years, and I saw some successful artisan enterprises in my time. And what I saw is that the ones that were beginning to expand into those new markets that were evolving were usually putting eco and fair story into the same mix. We started seeing that these enterprises had a story that could tell the social and the ecological angle together. And I think there's a magic in the artisan enterprise sector that can really tell the story effectively, because of the fact that it often is embodying natural resources, low carbon production, but also really high amount of livelihoods for people who are more marginalized than the alternative sectors. Chic and designs and functional products, I mean, the kind of products that were made often, those were the ones that were expanding, that had a more functional use. I also noticed that those that were engaging those up and coming ethical but commercial buyers in terms of long-term relationships were beginning to open up new possibilities, but they were also exploring online and digital as well as offline channels that they were already in. And this isn't easy to navigate. I know firsthand how difficult fulfillment challenges are, especially in international markets, but it is a real and important way of exploring what's possible. People telling a compelling story of that particularly very human impact, very easy to understand, that the consumer and the rest of the audiences could really envision what your enterprise is, where it exists, and how it's situated, and how it lives and breathes the interests of its own community. And lastly, those that retained their own visibility and built their own brands, so didn't just become anonymized suppliers into global brands, but were able to create some sort of a brand alongside those commercial buyers, or through online retail channels, were beginning to build their own brand and recognition with consumers. So those were my observations. Just to say that Doughnut community is growing. So if you've liked the things that you've heard, I invite you as individuals to join DoughnutEconomics.org's community and contribute to our discussions. It's not open to businesses, but to individuals. So we really need that human voice to help us sort of transform the global economy. That's a bit of a snapshot of what it's looking like currently. It's growing and expanding very fast at the moment. So thank you for this opportunity. I've gone a few minutes over, Priya, but I'll stop sharing now, and we can have a chat.
Thank you so much, Erinch. I don't think you've gone any minute over, because we still have about 15-20 minutes for questions, and I'm sure there will be questions, and I hope there are questions. So if you want to ask something from Erinch, please either put your questions on chat or happy to also have you sort of, switch on your video and ask the question. Yeah, any reflections as well?
Priya, I'm going to ask you a question if no one asks me a question.
Go for it.
Well, I was going to ask you, what are you seeing in terms of the enterprise design needs that are rising in the artisan sector? It's probably using different terminology that I've used different words, but how are these questions arising from what you're seeing?
I think, in India, we have a problem of marketing ourselves, honestly, because a lot of the kind of enterprise designs that you've shared with us, and honestly, we didn't even know it existed. And in forums like this, we end up talking about them, which is really nice. But like even with Business of Handmade, we realized that a lot of this kind of enterprise design has already been thought through, and it has also been thought through for scale, which is fascinating because I think the common perception is that artisan enterprises cannot scale, but while creating social impact. And I don't think that is the case. We have, these kind of enterprise models in India. It's just that we are not looking hard enough and learning from each other. So this becomes a really nice sort of forum to also start looking at what we have and start marketing it, like you said, start building the brand story around, successes that already exist. But to also answer your question, I think, if I may second guess, based on some of the conversations we are having with enterprises, I think the one big thing that seems to be missing is, where do we go to find the information? Where do we get started? If we want to build a responsible enterprise, where do we, where is the information available? Who is sitting? Who can we turn to? And how can we sort of, not let go of commercial returns, but still have a pathway or a supportive group or supportive mentors, supportive community that can sort of help us think through it instead of sort of operating within our own silos. And I can see Shefali Chachi from Hearth Ventures, who's building, the first fund perhaps of that is committed to supporting artisan enterprises and craft and creative enterprises working in the artisan economy. Shefali, do you want to jump in and tell us how you're thinking through Hearth Ventures and its enterprise design?
So firstly, thanks a lot, folks, for hosting this. There were some thought-provoking questions in terms of how an enterprise needs to, look at itself. We are in the process of building our initial portfolio, and really we'd like to develop, case studies and role models which actually attract a lot more capital into the sector, striking the balance between commercial viability as well as driving, as you said, a regenerative business rather than an extractive business. And we learn a lot in the whole process. And we are really energized by being in this community and, kind of connected with this, because there's be a lot of cross-pollination and learning. Sorry, I was walking, so slightly out of breath, but really enjoyed the discussion. So look forward to more conversation in this space, because I'm actually thinking about the possibilities, working with some of our, current companies in terms of what is possible, keeping these frameworks in mind, and very inspired. Thank you.
Thank you, Shefali. More power to you.
Thank you. And there was a request to put these 6 questions up, Priya, so I thought I'd put them up again from the chat. But yeah, I mean, Shefali, you're right that, it's the commercial viability that is absolutely pivotal, and the design of the business cannot undermine that. But there's, I think, a significant difference between a business that is trying to maximize profits and then extract it as quickly as possible for its investors, to a business that is focusing on commercial viability, commercially thriving, but putting all of its focus on maximizing its social impact and on investing into increasing its social impact rather than trying to extract as possible for its investors. And I think that distinction feels pivotal in the organizations I've seen, even though it's not often talked about in those terms.
Yes, I totally agree with that. Thank you.
I also think, Yeah, sorry, I was going to say we have a question about SMEs, right? From
Yes.
Matt.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, Matt, and I think somebody's off mute at the moment, so it might be extra noise might be coming through from somewhere. But yeah, I mean, for SMEs, I think it's going to be a matter of figuring out where their market is and who their partners need to be, because there isn't, I think, a one-size-fits-all commercial partner that I've seen. Again, I'm not speaking as an expert on the commercial partnerships in that sector, but someone who's worked around them and set up some of them, some of the partnerships. But what I've noticed is that, firstly, questions of, is it going to be export oriented or is it going to be domestic market, and being very deliberate about understanding what that market potential is for the business, and then figuring out who those partners need to be. There are all sorts of emerging e-commerce platforms, some of which are very high risk, and others can present really interesting opportunities for SMEs for export markets as well as the domestic market as well. But in terms of, I mean, people often ask me this when I was in the fair trade world, that, oh, right, how do I find the buyers that are going to be long-term committed to the artisan enterprises? And that often meant that actually becoming very effective at telling your story and having a functional product that is going to sell for those buyers. So the answer looked quite similar, that a lot of those buyers are looking for things that are going to sell. And in the past, there's been a lot of importers of artisanal products who have purchased based on their heart and their decisions, and they've often been, you know, stuck with loads of inventory over years. So a lot of buyers and those commercial partners have learned that lesson, that actually, again, it's not good for anybody for them to be commercially crippled because they've taken on and imported too many products that are difficult to sell. So I think my experience has been they're looking for those same things, and those questions or those perspectives I shared earlier around sort of observations of the successful artisan enterprise I saw. Well, these are the same questions, the same answer I would provide for, well, these are the things that help the SMEs, I think, make those connections with the right buyers.
We have a few questions, and starting with Komal, who asks, what should be the role of the artisan themselves in the enterprise design? Komal, do you have anything else to add to that question?
No, I just feel like, you know, when we are talking about enterprise design, we somehow, you know, we need to hear the voices of the artisans. So I just want to, you know, hear from you guys, I mean, what should be the role of artisans themselves?
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic question, Kamal. I mean, again, in that first question I asked, is which are the impacts, who are the stakeholders, and what are the actions that are going to be the priority? And if the priority are the artisans, then they should have a voice. You know, it should clearly, and the next question says, which voices are needed in the business? So if the answer to question one is the impact is on the artisans through their livelihoods and their well-being, and the stakeholders of the artisans, and the actions we want to promote are very inclusive trading relationships, supportive and distributive kind of trading relationships with the artisans, then their voice is going to be pivotal in shaping this. This doesn't necessarily mean that it becomes, you know, immediately a cooperative of artisans, etc. I think there are many innovative ways that the voice of the artisans can be included. Most of the examples, I think actually all of the examples I provided earlier from the artisan enterprise world had the artisans themselves represented on the board somehow, whether it was Core the Jute Works or Sasha or it was, you know, Creative Handicrafts in Mumbai or Mahaguti in Nepal, or Manos or Uruguay in Uruguay. They all had representatives and significant representatives on the board of the enterprise. Now, I think running those democratic processes can also be a bit cumbersome. So being clear around how do you streamline this and how do you get those voices into the boardroom without necessarily creating a very complicated political structure for who represents the artisans is also, I think, a live question. So I know I'm not necessarily giving you a blueprint for how to do it, but I absolutely think it's critical for those artisans to have a voice, because the assumptions that we might make about what their priority should be, or how to navigate some of these trade-offs might not be completely correct. So I think it's best to have those voices as well represented as possible, in a way that is efficient and effective in the governance of the organization. And yeah, I think, Priya, you're right that, the artisan sector isn't always great at marketing itself, because it doesn't necessarily always talk about how much of this has already been tried and tested. There's a lot of actually interesting models out there. If you look at, if I looked at the 40 plus members of the World Fair Trade Organization who are based in India, they all had something interesting and different going on in their governance model to bring in that voice of artisans. And I think there are many others in, Fair Trade Forum India and others, and who are also, got innovative ways of doing this. So I think the key word here is to tailor it so that it fits the realities of the business and the community, rather than just taking an off-the-shelf way of making this work. And it doesn't have to be a massively complicated task. You could start by just saying, look, we're gonna meet once a year, we're gonna elect a representative from the artisan group, they're gonna be on the board, let's start with that and let's go from there. It might be as simple as that. It might be other ways of doing it as well. So yeah, that's what my main suggestion on that front.
Thanks.
Thank you. And there is, just in that vein, I'd love to invite Pavitra Modaya, who's also asked quite a pertinent question around why we're missing this dialogue around organizational practice in the creation of sustainable businesses. Especially, hi, Pavi auntie.
Hi, Pavitra is in the meeting, so I am attending the court talk. Okay, I put that question. So if you analyze on any existing organizations or business or enterprise model, we are totally missing. And still we go for the mechanic idea of an organization where you have to run for outcome, output, income, rather than understanding what really the artisan need, what the beneficiaries or the customers need, and learn from that and create a sustainable model organization. And why still, even after analyzing all this, in artisan field, we miss it always. Why it is happening?
It's such a good question, Pavitra. Why is it happening? I think people feel time poor. People feel like they want to get on with it. They want to get practical. They want to get on the ground. They want to make some sales first. They don't want to experiment with new things. Let's just keep this as a private business that's owned by one family or one individual, and that's simple, and we can deal with it later. Like, those are the answers I've heard about why. But to be honest, I think it's such an important question, because it helps lock in the mission long term. It also helps take the pressure off, individual leaders to do all of the heavy lifting of figuring out how to be socially and ecologically sustainable. It brings in new voices, it brings in new perspectives that might have a helpful and unexpected new ideas might arise out of them. So I think that the opportunity to be deliberate about the design of the enterprise and the bringing in the right voices and the right ownership models, etc., over time, have got huge upsides. But too often it gets ignored. And yeah, I think it's high time that we talk about this, because this is the direction the conversation is going in sustainability. This, in the fastest growing communities of sustainable businesses are things like B Corps in the West. They are talking about social enterprise. They're talking about mission and purpose. And you know what? This is where mission and purpose questions leads to, okay, where does the rubber hit the road? How am I organized to put mission and purpose first? And too often people are actually that don't have a very deep mission and purpose, and in some of those movements that I'm seeing out there are getting out in front, when artisan enterprises who have got a very deep mission and purpose just haven't taken this tiny step of clarifying the structure and design of the enterprise, so they can talk about it and say, hey, we're partly owned by our artisans. Hey, we're partly owned by our community. Hey, our board includes all these voices. Look at the alternatives. That's not how a fast fashion factory operates. And I think there's a powerful story there and opportunity.
Thanks, Erinch. There's another question. Itisha, do you want to ask your question instead of me reading it out?
Yeah, hi. So my question was that while you're going to impact investors of, while you're raising money, so there's a question that impact investors always have, that in 2 years, what is the amount of impact that you will be generating in a particular cluster. So when you're building a brand, so there is, you know, that commercial threshold that beyond these many number of artisans you cannot go. So that is my question, that, you know, what is that optimum number of artisans that can be involved in a particular brand, in a particular product category? So and you know, how do you actually plan for it? Like, if I have to tell that in 2 years I'll be generating employment for, suppose, 1,000 artisans. So you know, you can plan it 1,000 artisans, but there has to be like a you know, proper method of doing it. That how.
Oh, Atisha, I think you cut out, but I think I got the crux of your question, which is a very good one. That often the way these questions, this discussion manifests is actually through the lens of, and I'll turn off my slide sharing, by the way.
Sorry,
So
I think my internet went. Sorry.
Oh,
Was
no
my
problem.
question audible? Like.
Oh, Atisha, I think I got the question, so I might give it a crack and tell me if I've missed anything. But yeah, you're right that the impact question is often the one that people ask about rather than the organizational design question in terms of the investors themselves. And but increasingly we are seeing impact investors recognize that if the design of the enterprise is solid and is mission-led, then actually it's going to do the heavy lifting for it of focusing on impact, of delivering impact. Now, alongside that, measurement's really important, and it's really difficult to give this is the right number, because as you know, incomes and livelihoods could be seasonal. You know, it could be a proportion of an individual's livelihood portfolio. Like an artisan will earn money in multiple ways. It's not like a full-time employment in many of these places. So as a result, I think we have to educate the people that are asking us about these questions and to give them a picture of what the lives of these individuals look like, rather than just give them a big number with lots of zeros attached to it. We'll give them the number as well, but that number is going to, you know, by itself, 100, 1,000, 3,000, you know, some of the organizations I gave examples of have got thousands of producers in these producer groups that co-own, co-govern those organizations. But many of those individual producers are earning money elsewhere as well. So what proportion of their livelihood the organization is responsible for, it's always quite a complicated story, unfortunately. And that's the realities of the artisan sector, that, you know, it's not all full-time employment in the way that some of the impact investors living in countries where that's norm might need a bit of education on this.
Thanks, Erinch. Thanks a ton. Really a pleasure having you.
Absolute pleasure. Great to be back, and thank you for your engagement and insights, everybody. It was really fun.